Hi everyone, welcome to this video about Paper 1 Question 4 with AQA, English Language, which is all about critical evaluation or giving your own insight about a particular aspect of the text, usually about characters in the extract, because by the time you get to the second half of the extract, that's where the characters are talking or where the characters are being described to us. So question 4 tends to be about characters and their relationships with each other. The aim of this video is to give you an example question and also to give you a shorter text to practice the question with. It's a text that I have written. So this video will also put particular emphasis on critically engaging with that text, which means to read it and annotate it. Then to take the text to brainstorm some ideas related to the question, and then to finish the video by showing you an example paragraph showing you how to answer this question in an exam. Question for paper 1, question 4 will always be worded as a quotation that somebody has allegedly said. Chances are the examiner has made it up. Within that question, within that quotation, there's going to be key information which I have color-coded here in red and blue. This information is very important because it determines what you look for in the extract in terms of the evidence you go to find. So in this case, the examiner is asking you specifically about the characters of the men from the city as being dislikable characters and the people from the village being much more sympathetic and we like them as readers. So this is a question about characters and about people. Really important that you understand from reading that task what exactly you're looking for, because to stay on task you need to be talking about what they give you to talk about. So here it's the men in the village, the villagers. The question will always finish with to what extent do you agree, because it's asking you for your personal opinion, which is often what literature is about. It's about engaging with a viewpoint that you have. And it's about having the flexibility to have a viewpoint and not just recite what somebody else has said about it, to have your own view. So I always say to students to strongly agree or partly agree, but it's always harder to disagree because there's always less evidence, perhaps, to disagree. So you are free to disagree, but there's always going to be perhaps less evidence. So students often find it easier to agree with the task than disagree. Because this is quite a sizable question in terms of marks, it's out of 20, which is the biggest of the reading questions in this paper. You're going to be supported with three bullet points underneath the question. The first bullet point changes based on the question, but the second and third bullet point always remains the same. How, meaning writer's methods, language, structure, sentence types, and support, which means quote evidence from the extract, which you should have been doing already for questions 2 and 3, language and structure for AQA or other reading questions. So the key thing that I want you to take away from this is it's really important to know exactly what you're being asked to write about, which is why it's a good idea to circle or highlight the focus of the question. The extract that we're going to be using is a short extract that I have written myself for my A-level group actually, but I thought it would also be useful for this video as well. And I've named it A Rural Affair. And I've put the question there in the box to remind us what we're looking for. Since the question for question 4 will always be asking you to analyse the second half of the extract, this is pretty much as much text as you will have to work with in the exam anyway. So the extract in the exam might be twice as long as this, but question 4 is always about the second half of it. So actually it probably won't be too dissimilar here to the amount of text that's on the screen now. I'm going to read through this and then I'm going to say, okay, we need to look for evidence that proves that the student that said that in the box is correct. The villagers gathered in the small country hall, the place of many village gatherings over the decades. They sat together with eyes full of suspicion and loathing. Many of the women wore daisy chains and wildflowers in their hair and carried jars of homemade honey for the neighbours, made from the bees in their gardens. Mr. Daniels had even brought some eggs from his hens to share. At 8:30 precisely, the men from the city entered, failing to greet any of the natives. They wore high hats and tweed jackets, and carried leather folders embossed with gold lettering, inside of which were uncreased sheets of white paper, neatly typed. Mrs. Dobbins refused to take her jar of honey off the vacant seat beside her, so she wouldn't have to sit next to one of the men, but Master Taylor removed the jar dismissively so he could sit down, placing the jar on the floor. Sir Jackson sat at the front of the hall, next to Master Clark, smiling smugly. "I told you, these people aren't like us, dressed in their weeds and stinking flowers. Eating berries from the hedges, no doubt, like pigs." With that, the meeting began to see if the lower farms would be demolished to make way for housing. Mr. Daniels and his 5 sons didn't have much hope. With a sinking heart, they knew this would be the last harvest they gleaned from Lower Swell Farm. Okay, so you can pause this video now to find evidence that we either dislike the men from the city, or, alternatively, we prefer the villagers. So the men from the city are Sir Jackson, Master Clark, and Master Taylor, and the villagers are Mr. Daniels and his 5 sons, and Mrs. Dobbins. So those are the 2 groups of characters. So this is about now critically engaging with the extract and trying to find evidence that we could then use to support the quote there in the top box, the question. So here we have the evidence, and there's a lot of evidence that might be useful here. So the red is to do with the men. So the fact that the villagers are looking at these men with suspicion and loathing, again, almost encourages us to dislike them, doesn't it? We've then got the fact that they failed to greet any of the natives. Their clothes are very different to the more modest clothing of the villagers, suggesting they're wealthy and perhaps arrogant. Master Taylor removed the jar dismissively so he could sit down, so he's not really interested in the villagers or their way of life. And the dialogue there at the bottom between Sir Jackson and Master Clark is very telling as well. So he says that they're dressed in weeds and stinking flowers, and there's a simile there in which they compare the villagers to pigs. And we've got to think of the connotations of pigs. Pigs means uncivilized or dirty or uncultivated or inhumane or something like that, beast-like. So the dialogue there between these 2 characters also shows that these 2 people don't really understand the villagers, and they also are very kind of detached from this rural village. You could also call that a zoomorphism in terms of likening people to an animal like that. So we have got methods: dialogue, simile, we've got some adjectives, we've got the adverb dismissively, we've got the adverb smugly, which I haven't actually highlighted. So there are methods in there, and even though this is not an explicit language question, we still have to tie in the methods. Remember, the second bullet point says how, which means methods. Alternatively, you might also want to have a second paragraph talking about the villagers, and the text that's in blue perhaps proves that the student in that box is correct, that we do actually like the villagers more. The fact that they have this very modest, very rural life, the fact they're wearing daisy chains and wildflowers in their hair, hens and eggs and honey. It's a community that is very much to do with the ground, nature. This is a community that gets its identity from nature. And what these men are representing is a kind of a conflict to that. They're wanting the land to put houses on to sell for profit. So these outsiders, these men from the city, represent a threat to this rural community. At the bottom there, Mr. Daniels and his sons are the farmers, I presume, and they live on Lower Swell Farm. And it says, with a sinking heart, they knew that this would be the last harvest that they had, because they're going to demolish their farm and their home for housing. So Mr. Daniels and his sons might be homeless because of the way in which these men from the city want the land to build houses on for money and greed. So we feel sorry for him there, because what is a farm without land? What is a farm without a farmhouse? What is a farm without animals or crops? It's not a farm. And, farming is not a job. It's often a way of life. And this is a way of life that, for Mr. Daniels at least, looks like is at risk. So we tend to look at the evidence, and we tend to agree with the student that we do also dislike the men from the city, and we do also sympathise with the villagers. So that student is pretty accurate there, which is why it's much easier to agree than disagree with that student. So let's just brainstorm briefly before we look at the example response. The men are motivated by greed and money rather than actually caring about the villagers and their traditional way of life. This is a place that has traditions, rural traditions, and they don't care about that because it's not their own traditions. Men are taking away the villagers' heritage and their identity and their way of life. They show no remorse. The irony is, of course, that they're knocking people's homes down to build new homes for people. But there's already homes there. So there's an irony there. The possessions that they own are very different. So you have the modest daisy chains and wildflowers, not jewellery here, compared to the high hats and the tweed jackets, leather, gold lettering, suggesting money, wealth and expense. So the villagers are much more modest, and they use the land for free. They go blackberrying to make blackberry pies and things, but the men in the city pay money for expensive clothes and accessories because they want to look the part. So there's a degree of perhaps arrogance or materialism there. And finally, the men seem rude and dismissive, as proved by that dialogue here. They think that the villagers are uncivilized and animalistic. There's no empathy, and they're also quite offensive and insulting, perhaps, even though, ironically, they're taking their land away, so should be quite thankful, but they're not. So we've got plenty to say in terms of the planning. We've also got our methods in there as well, and we've got our quotes in colours there, linking to the particular part of the question. So the last thing I'm going to show you is how this all comes together in an example paragraph. This might not be the whole response. It could be. If you wrote something like this in 20 minutes, that would be really, really good. There might be other things to say, though, but I'll let you judge whether or not you want to add more. So the person starts by saying, I strongly agree that the reader is encouraged to dislike the men from the city and sympathise with the situation the villagers are in. One of the ways this is achieved is through the way in which the men seem to be motivated by greed and seem to show no guilt or remorse for destroying people's way of life. The men are outsiders and don't understand the villagers' traditions or way of life, and instead of trying to get to know them, they are rude and dismissive. When they arrived in the village hall after keeping the villagers waiting, they failed to greet any of the natives, and when they sat down for the meeting to start, the dialogue between Sir Jackson and Master Clark shows them to be arrogant and sneering. They accuse the villagers of wearing weeds and stinking flowers instead of pretty flowers, and then accuse the villagers of being pigs through a simile, suggesting they are uncivilized and animalistic because they might eat wild fruit and berries from the hedges. And why wouldn't you? It's free. This shows the men to be rude and dismissive, uncaring towards the natives. There seems to be no shred of remorse for destroying these people's livelihoods and homes. In contrast, readers tend to sympathise with the villagers because of their modest lives, but also the fact that the end of the extract suggests that the homes will be built anyway. With a sinking heart, they knew this would be the last harvest, meaning that their rural community will be destroyed by a wealthy elite that has made no attempt to understand them. It is also perhaps ironic that their homes and farms will be demolished to make way for more homes that the villagers probably won't be able to afford anyway. So there's an irony there. Why would you knock down somebody's house that they've been living in for centuries, maybe as a farming community, and then price them out of the market? So you can see here that this is a student who is using methods. We've got simile, we've got some quoting, we've got some dialogue in there. So there are methods in there, but they're just very, very confident. They know exactly what they're talking about, and more importantly, they understand the characters. And like I said at the beginning of this video, this is a question usually about people. It's usually about characters. And students that tend to do well with question 4 understand the characters and understand what they're doing, why they're doing it, and the relationships with other characters, the rivalry, the mixing of them. They understand the dynamics of the relationships of the characters and the profile of the characters. So try with question 4 to understand who is your cast, who are the characters, what are they like, and chances are if you understand the characters well, you'll be able to do okay with this question. Okay, so that is an example of paper 1 question 4 with AQA anyway, but this kind of question does appear in other specifications as well with other exam boards, so it might be useful even if you're not studying AQA. Okay, so thank you very much for watching and good luck.